So this part of history is going to focus on the Atlantic slave trade, and in particularly between the years 1770 and 1807. And we're going to look at how it started, how it was organised, why it happened, and then what was the consequences, particularly for the UK, on being a part of the kind of Atlantic slave trade. So, first of all, what is a slave? So a slave is a human being that is owned by another human being. Bit like an animal or any object like your phone, you own it, it belongs to you. So that is the way that the slave trade was set up. Human beings were owned by other human beings and made to do work for them. So slaves had no rights. They were seen as objects and not as people. So the slave owner can beat them, starve them, do whatever they want with them because they were objects and not human beings. And even if a slave had kids, their kids did not actually belong to them. They belonged to the owner, who then could sell your kids to be slaves to someone else, and they could make money from you having children. And by the end of the 1770s, many ships had carried black slaves from Africa to the Americas to do the jobs that white people on these farms didn't want to do. I'm going to cover a wee bit on that a bit later on. So, how did it start? What was the cause of it? Well, the main cause of it was sugar and spice. So, in this era, a lot of the food in the UK was pretty bland and boring and tasteless. So people would add spices and honey to their meals, to their water, their tea, whatever they were drinking. They would add spices and honey to give it some sort of flavour. Now, what happened was Britain couldn't get some of the spices, so Christopher Columbus, and we'll come to that, sailed to get some spices and ended up discovering America, which we'll talk about in a second. So people used honey and spices, and they used it to flavour food, their meat and their wine, because 500 years ago we didn't actually know about sugar. We didn't know it existed, even though it's in a lot of our foods today. So, talking about Christopher Columbus then, like I mentioned, he discovered America, but he didn't mean it. It was by accident. He was trying to sail to India. He was trying to prove that the globe was round and he could sail one way and reach India. So he could sail west towards, as we now know, America, and hit India. But he came across an island that was in the west, and it's called the West Indies. And this was actually America. But the West Indies could grow sugar. So when he was looking for spices, he found places that were growing sugar, and he found these sugar crops. Now, what happened was sugar was so valuable because it makes our food taste much better. So what happened was these plantations or farms in the West Indies, people wanted to grow sugar and take it back to the UK and France and Spain and sell it and make money from it. So the first slaves happened in 1567. A guy called John Hawkins, if I move myself there, a guy called John Hawkins sailed to West Africa. He attacked the villages. He captured about 250 Africans. He took them across the Atlantic Ocean. He sold them to plantation owners, and plantations is the name of the farms where sugar's grown. So he sold them to plantation owners. These owners made the slaves work on their farms, and then soon other nations got wind of what was happening and followed suit. Spain and France also owned islands, and they also wanted to grow sugar and other crops that the West Indies allowed them to grow. So soon Spain, Britain and France owned islands in the West Indies. They all wanted to grow sugar and other crops such as tobacco and cotton, but they all had the same problem with finding workers. The problem was they couldn't find people to do the hard work that involved in growing these crops. So what happens was they got slaves, they bought slaves in, and these slaves were forced to work on their plantations, which is the name of the farms, as we already know. So the route we have that kind of happens was from Britain, they would travel to the Cape Coast Castle in Africa. They would then capture their slaves. They would then take the slaves over to the West Indies, and then from the West Indies they would take the crops back to the UK. So the journey looked a bit like this. So materials and possessions would go from the UK to Africa, and it'd be traded for slaves. The slaves would be taken to the West Indies to work on the plantation. The crops grown would then be taken back to Britain to be sold to make money. And the journey over the Atlantic Ocean was known as the Middle Passage. So, the slave trade was huge. In 1790, a huge number of slaves were taken from Africa to the Americas. In Britain, British ships actually took the most slaves over, with 38,000 slaves. So as you can see, that huge number of slaves taken from where they lived and moved over to the plantation and treated quite horribly. So now what I want you to do is jump onto your OneNote page and complete the tasks associated with this lesson and answer some of the questions. If you have any questions, then jump into the posts conversation or the posts area of this Teams and ask a question, and I'm sure someone will be able to help you out and give you an answer.